The movie is based on actual events. The story is narrated by the main character, Andy Nicol, and it is set in the 1960s. Andy begins the narration by saying that children are cruel. He proceeds to describe a classmate he calls Big G. Big G has orange hair, big ears, and a big head. G stands for ginger, since he is a redhead. Big is for his tall stature. Andy thinks God is too cruel for not compensating Big G with at least good looks, like God did for redhead Lucille Ball and big-eared Clark Gable. During English class, everyone's favorite teacher, Mr. Stephen Simon, is reading Joan of Arc to the 8th graders. Students are paying attention to the lesson and seem to enjoy it. At the end of the class, Mr. Simon announces that he will divide them into pairs to work on their final project. To make students work collaboratively with their respective partner, he says each pair will be given 1 grade. He pairs Andy with Big G, whose real name is Stanley Minor. Students mock Stanley with the nickname Big G. Andy doesn't look happy to be teamed up with Stanley. Other students start snickering, as if it is an unfortunate situation for Andy. Mr. Simon asks the students to behave. Stanley's expressions stay the same, calm and poised, as if he is used to this treatment. Mr. Simon tells Andy that he has paired him with Stanley for a reason, and he should feel lucky about it. Andy comes up with an excuse to avoid working with Stanley. He says to Mr. Simon that Stanley is too smart to work with him. Andy thinks that his writing skills are bad and will affect the overall grade. Mr. Simon thinks Andy writes very well, since he has a keen eye and a commendable perspective. It is only grammar and spelling he is bad at. Other than that, he is a promising writer, and he should believe that. Mr. Simon makes Andy say out loud, "I am a writer, that's what I am," with confidence and belief. It is recess time in school. Ricky Brown is bullying Stanley. Other students are laughing and calling Stanley names, as Ricky sprays Stanley's pants with a water gun. Andy's eyes meet Stanley's. Andy thinks Big G has an aura of a noble and dignified person. People who have sensitive hearts can feel that. Andy knows that he isn't one of them. But he stands there seeing Stanley get bullied, and does nothing about it. In another part of the school, at recess time, Sam is bullying Norman Grunmeyer. Sam wants Norman to give him his lunch, which Norman doesn't have. Norman gives him cash to save himself from getting beaten up. Andy thinks Sam shouldn't have given the cash to Sam. Norman believes in giving the bully whatever he wants to save himself. Andy insists that Sam isn't as dangerous as Ricky. Norman points out that Sam once thrusted his head into a toilet and broke his tooth. Sam is equally as violent as Ricky, according to Norman. Andy asks about the whereabouts of Big G, who is Norman's best friend. Norman is shocked that someone is interested in asking for Big G. Andy tells him he has been paired with Big G for a project. Norman thinks Andy is fortunate for having Stanley as a partner, since he is the brightest student in the school. Norman tells him where Stanley probably is, and says that Stanley is different from the other students. He wants to say more, but stops, probably because he finds it pointless to say anything. Big G is in the geek corner, a spot where the nerds and least liked students sit in their free time. These nerdy students are referred to as cooties. Andy is standing outside the periphery of the infamous geek corner. He is sure of the laughter that will follow him if he steps into the territory of the outcasts. He calls out Big G and steps inside the geek corner to talk to him. Stanley knows that Andy does not want to work with him, so he suggests doing the entire project by himself, for the two of them. The idea sounds appealing to Andy. He looks over his shoulder at the other students, making fun of him for talking to an outcast. He realizes that he can't fool Mr. Simon, so he needs to work in collaboration with Big G. Andy mows the lawn at home. This is one of his chores. His father calls him a jughead for missing a spot. Andy, in his defense, says he meant to come back to it later. His father wants him to mow like he does, without leaving any spots for the next round. There shouldn't be any second round, so Andy should better pay attention when mowing. He starts mowing the lawn himself to show Andy how it is done properly. Annoyed at his father, Andy shakes his head and goes inside the house. He seems to have a very friendly relationship with his kind-looking mother. He is whining about Big G not being available for working on the project, as he has a jam-packed schedule. It is only at the geek corner, during a lunch break, where they can work together on the project. Mrs. Nicol picks up on the term geek corner and is kind of sensing the stigma attached to it. She responds to the complaint Andy has against Stanley, saying that Geek Corner must be the only place Stanley feels safe. Andy wonders why God made Big G ugly and let people ridicule him. Mrs. Nicol says God may not have found any problem with him. Then, she gently corrects Andy for not calling Stanley by his correct name. Andy and Dan are walking home after school. They talk about how Mr. Simon won a car in a contest, where he had to write 25 words on how to bring peace to the world. They are impressed with Mr. Simon, who won the coolest car they have ever seen. Both of them get distracted by Mary Clear, the best kisser in the school, and the dream girl of every boy there. Then, there is Karen Connor, the most unattractive girl in the school, and one of the outcasts who sit in the geek corner. She is mocked as Cootie Connor. Jason Friel bumps into her by accident, and starts panicking. Physical contact with an outcast means you are going to die. Those who see that Jason is contaminated run miles away from him. Myron Stewart is the one who can help Jason. Myron is considered an expert on cooties. Myron tells him the cure: to touch Karen again in the geek corner and chant that the cooties may remain with her only. In the geek corner, Norman is angry at Stanley for not saving himself from Ricky Brown. All Stanley has to do is give his lunch to Ricky or do his homework for him. Stanley thinks that it isn't the right thing to do. Andy asks both of them to stop arguing and work on the project. Now, Norman and Andy start quarreling. Doris informs Stanley about Jason hitting Karen. Stanley, Norman, and Andy rush to rescue Karen. Jason was flogging defenseless Karen with his zipper while chanting what Myron had told him to say. Stanley pulls Jason away from Karen and lifts him up, pinning him against the wall. Norman is bursting with anger when he asks Stanley to break some bones. But Stanley let Jason go. Norman goes crazy at Stanley for being so forgiving when he had his chance to avenge. Andy can't comprehend why a tall and strong person, like Stanley, can let the likes of Ricky and Jason bully him. Stanley's response is that he can't teach these bullies to act nice by beating them, and even if somehow he makes them stop, there will be others to replace them. Stanley runs to Mr. Simon to inform him of the incident. Mr. Simon goes to find Karen, weeping to herself and hiding in the toilet. He holds her hand and makes her stand up. The next day, Mr. Simon doesn't feel like teaching the class. He looks deeply sad about what happened to poor Karen. The whipping gave her serious cuts on the skin, and she was sent to the hospital. Jason is suspended. Head held down in melancholy, Mr. Simon scribbles on the blackboard, "Human dignity plus compassion equals peace." It was this 4-letter essay that won him a car. Besides mowing the lawn, Andy works as a paperboy as well, in exchange for some cash or cookies. At Mary Claire's house, he deliberately throws the newspaper a bit far from the doorstep, which gives himself an excuse to go up really close to her house. Today, he is caught red-handed by Mr. Claire, who is curious to know why it is only his newspaper that needs Andy to walk all the way to the house to deliver it. Andy fails to come up with any justification. He promises he will throw the newspaper right at the doorstep next time. Mary comes out, and Andy can't help but gawk at her. He knows that she is aware of the effect she has on boys. The other job Andy does is for assistant principal. On Fridays, he does multiple copies of flyers and reminders. Today, he has to make copies of a flyer for the school's upcoming talent show. He learns that Stanley is going to sing in the talent show. He needs to talk to Stanley about taking this stupid risk. Norman never heard Stanley sing. He thinks Stanley will make a laughingstock of himself by doing so, in front of the entire school. Stanley says he loves to sing, and he has been doing it forever. He deserves to show off his abilities in the talent show, just like everyone else. Andy suggests that he sings with a band. Singing solo is a call for bullying. Stanley is persistent in his decision. Karen supports him, and Norman storms away angrily. He is only trying to protect Stanley. Barbara Foss, Mary's best friend, comes up to Andy and tells him that Mary fancies him. Andy is in disbelief. It is something surreal that Mary Claire wants to be in a relationship with him. He doesn't believe Barbara, at least not yet. Today, Andy is collecting his payments for delivering the paper. Mary Claire comes out to give him the cash. Andy, like always, is short of words and stutters in front of her. She smiles at him. Andy is now sure that Mary is into him. Andy gets on his bike to collect the money from other customers. A wet newspaper hurled in his direction knocks him off his bike. It is Ricky. He pushes Andy back to the ground when he tries to get up and walks away with impunity, taking Andy's bag of cash and cookies. Bruce Modak, a classmate, wonders if Mr. Simon is still Andy's favorite teacher. As he partnered him up with Big G, Modak says his dad thinks Mr. Simon is a homosexual. Andy doesn't know what it means. Jason, who overhears the conversation, is happy to finally find something against Mr. Simon. Andy asks 2 other classmates, but neither of them explains what Bruce said. Andy and Stanley are in the geek corner, working on the project. Stanley reads out a poem, whose title Andy suggests to be Prejudice. Stanley thinks prejudice carries subjective meanings. He thinks tolerance is a more suitable title. It means allowing opinions different from yours to thrive and breathe freely. Tolerance doesn't ask you to like a person. Jason asks Modak if a teacher can get fired if he is a homosexual. Modak gives a definitive yes. Jason asks Modak to tell him what homosexuality really is. To get the answers from Modak, he promises to clean Modak's room for 2 weeks. Andy is trying to glue a wing to a model plane. He hears his father coming behind him. Andy's expression is expectant. His father says that Andy is using too much glue. Andy is helpless. He says he was going to scrape off the extra glue afterwards. Mr. Nickel thinks Andy should do it the proper way in the first place. Andy walks away with impotent anger, leaving his father to fix the model his way. He goes and sits with his mom in the TV lounge. He asks if romantic relationships took place between 8th graders and her time. She smiles and says yes. It is a sweet but stressful experience. She asks Andy if he is going to have a relationship. He denies it. She advises him to use more deodorant, just in case. He asks Mrs. Nickel what is a homosexual. She explains it to him and makes him understand that no matter what, Mr. Simon is the best teacher for him. His sexuality has got nothing to do with his profession or character. Later that night, Mr. and Mrs. Nickel have an argument. Mr. Nickel isn't pleased of the idea of a homosexual teaching his kid. Mrs. Nickel thinks it must be a rumor, and even if it is true, it shouldn't matter, since Mr. Simon is a great teacher. Meanwhile, Jason tells his mom about Mr. Simon being a possible homosexual. She is proud of his son for opening up to her. She talks to his husband about it. Today, Mr. Simon is going to give each student a ride in his new car. Everyone is very excited, and Mr. Simon enjoys spoiling his students. Ricky mocks Stanley and Andy. Mary calls Ricky out for it. Mr. Ed Friel is at the principal's office, who is asking him for proof of the allegation he has made against Mr. Simon. All Mr. Friel has is Jason's words. The principal, Evelyn Kellner, defends Mr. Simon, saying he has been awarded the title of best teacher for a reason. Mr. Friel says homosexuality is a disease, and it will eventually affect Mr. Simon's profession as well, even if he is the best teacher out there. The principal never noticed anything odd with Mr. Simon in the 12 years of her acquaintance with him. She tells Mr. Friel that Mr. Simon was married once, but his wife died. Mr. Friel seems very confident in his accusation. He thinks it is expected of homosexuals to hide their nature behind the facade of marriage. The principal is silent when Mr. Friel points out that Mr. Simon never remarried. Mr. Friel threatens to go to the press and spread the news to every parent. The principal says she will talk to Mr. Simon herself to find out the truth. She goes to talk to Mr. Simon in his free period. She just can't bring herself up to talk to him about this since she has a lot of respect for him. She manages to tell him anyways. She thinks it is Jason getting back at Mr. Simon because of the support Mr. Simon gave to Karen. Mr. Simon is a bit taken aback. He fails to understand the connection people are building between his private life and his work as a teacher. Principal Evelyn says that as long as Mr. Simon denies it, all will be fine. Evelyn asks him if he is a homosexual or not. He chooses not to answer. Answering such a question is accepting its legitimacy. He doesn't want anyone to disregard who he really is as a teacher and define him with an irrelevant identity. Andy is preparing to start off his relationship with Mary. He trades 3 Mantle rookie baseball cards for an ID bracelet for Mary. He would, later on, learn the true value of those cards, which he traded for a bracelet worth a few dollars. The news of his and Mary's reunion is spreading in the school like wildfire. Ricky Brown gets to know about it as well, and he is going to beat Andy up. Mary had her longest relationship with Ricky. She broke up with him. Ricky still fancies her. Andy is impressed to know that someone has the guts to break up with Ricky Brown. Principal Kellner decides to talk to the Friel family and calm them down. She meets them at their house. She vouches for the good character of Mr. Simon. Mrs. Friel says they do believe he is a great teacher, but the problem is, students look up to him, and him being a homosexual isn't worthy of that. It is a religious obligation that the school must get rid of him. Principal Kellner snaps back at them, saying they need to worry more about their kid, Jason, who wounded a poor girl because he thinks she is ugly. Mr. Friel advances towards the principal in order to intimidate her. Mrs. Friel stops him. Mr. Friel says he has punished his son for his wrongdoing, but he is a kid after all. Principal Kellner asserts that she doesn't know whether Mr. Simon is a homosexual or not, but it isn't important to her. Mr. Friel threatens her again that he will let the news spread. Andy is anxious about the possibility of Mr. Simon getting fired. His dad thinks there is no need to worry yet, since nothing has been confirmed. Mrs. Nickel mentions the Salem witch hunt and points out how false accusations are often considered facts. Mr. Nickel asks if Andy has seen Mr. Simon touching any student inappropriately. Andy confirms that he hasn't seen anything like that. Mrs. Nickel is furious at him for talking so explicitly with Andy. Mr. Simon and Principal Kellner are meeting in a cafe. It amazes her that someone with no evidence can tarnish the reputation of a man, just like that. She is the first female principal in the county. Mr. Simon is voted the best teacher in California. She knows she will be jobless if the rumor gets to the public. Mr. Simon says that he will quit, but he will not deny it. It is for children's sake that he better not deny it. Andy sees that Mr. Simon's car has an on sale label. Mr. Simon is using cardboard boxes to pack his stuff. He is going away to Florida and will not be coming back next year. Andy is sad about it. He talks to Dan about it while sitting on a bench during the lunch hour. Dan thinks Mr. Simon is leaving because the rumor is true. Andy wants to give him some farewell gifts. Dan says they should have known about his sexuality when he talked about ballet. The stereotypes attached to homosexuality are ridiculous. Ricky arrives out of nowhere and punches Andy in his stomach. Dan abandons Andy and runs away. Ricky asks Andy to stay away from Mary. He is about to hit him again when Stanley comes and asks him to leave Andy alone. Andy tries to steer clear of Mary, but he can't when she comes up to him. He gives her the ID bracelet, and their relationship is official now. Not caring about Ricky's warnings anymore, Andy is going to see Mary near the tunnel after school. He can't focus, not even in Mr. Simon's class. It is his first time kissing, so he is nervous. He tries really hard not to sweat too much during the game period. The clock strikes 3 p.m., and it is the time to meet Mary. Ricky appears in his way when he reaches the other end of the tunnel. Just when Andy has accepted his fate, Mary shouts at Ricky to let Andy go, with the threat that she will tell on him to the principal for stealing money once. Ricky marches off. Mary asks Andy to meet her, to make out after the talent show. Tonight is the talent show. Andy meets a nervous and scared Stanley, waiting for his turn to perform. Andy apologizes for not helping him when Ricky sprayed his pants with a water gun. He calls Stanley the bravest boy he knows. Stanley wishes Norman to be there for him. The show has started. Andy rushes to meet Norman, to convince him to come see his best friend perform. Norman says he can't see people making fun of Stanley. There is no saving Stanley tonight. Andy suggests that he and Norman could be Stanley's saviors. Stanley has what most people lack, dignity. He is not like the others. Norman does go to see Stanley. He can't help but ask him why he is so insistent upon doing this. Stanley says, "I am a singer, that's what I am." The statement that defies whatever hurdle or doubt comes his way, and enables him to do what he wants to do. The audience at the talent show is mesmerized by an unexpectedly great drum solo, performed by Tommy Kenner, who is otherwise dull at studies. Next is Stanley, who is going to sing a song he wrote himself. Stanley comes on stage, and the crowd starts snickering. Andy sees Ricky holding a tomato, ready to hit Stanley with it. He quietly goes behind Ricky and kicks him in between his legs. Ricky draws the attention of the crowd by loudly wailing. Mr. Simon handles the situation and takes Ricky out of the hall, saying he must be having bowel issues. He gives Andy a thumbs up for teaching Ricky a lesson and asks the crowd to pay attention to Stanley's singing. Stanley sings about having the courage to dream, despite whatever obstacles life throws at you. He has people in tears, clapping for him. After the talent show, Andy meets Mary at the tunnel. They have an intimate moment. The entire last week of 8th grade, they keep on meeting and having intimate time together. The last day of school, Mr. Simon reads the end of Joan of Arc. He gives back the marked projects to the students. Stanley and Andy get a plus on their paper. Mr. Simon tells them he is most proud of them, more than he has ever been of any other students. Andy asks what he is going to do. He says he will be finding another school to teach in. "I am a teacher, that's what I am," he tells her. Andy, along with all of his classmates, surprises Mr. Simon with loads of flowers, piled up in his car's backseat. They thank him for being the best teacher. Andy bids goodbye to Stanley by addressing him as Stanley in front of the whole school. It takes everyone by surprise. Stanley has a big smile on his face. Andy has a question to ask Mr. Simon. He drops by his house. He sees a photo of Mr. Simon with his wife. Mr. Simon tells him he loved his wife too much to remarry. She died 19 years ago. This cleared the rumor, but that is not what is important to Andy anymore. He wants to know what was the reason behind Mr. Simon pairing him with Stanley. Mr. Simon says that he wants Andy to make the right choices, at the right time. The movie ends with Andy mowing the lawn. His dad comes to scold him for a spot he has missed. This time, Andy is going to stand his ground. He will tell his dad that he loves mowing the lawn, so he is sure he can do it very well. He is going to do it his way.